We're recording, and welcome everybody who's joined, and welcome everybody who's watching the recorded version of this to today's remote game studio webinar. I'm here today with Patrick Palm, co-founder and CEO of Favro, and Carlos Sanchez from Xbox Gaming for Everyone. Correct, Carlos?
Yep.
Yep. So thank you for joining us today as our special guest. It's a pleasure to have you. And as usual, we're going to be presenting out of Favro, as you can see here. And before I pass it over to you, Patrick, I just want to quickly show everybody the agenda. And this is on a Favro timeline view of a board. So here we're going to start out with a little bit of introduction of a special guest and also Patrick and myself. And then Patrick's going to have a conversation with Carlos about game production in general and specifically to his studio's move to remote and just remote work in general, how kind of tips and tricks, how that's worked out for him and the people he's worked with at Microsoft. Then we're going to jump in and I'm going to take over and talk about specifically about the remote game studio. What are the benefits? What are the challenges? How remote work done right, the benefits can far outweigh those challenges, at least in our opinion, and what we've seen with many Favro customers in the game industry. Talk about some solutions, some real world examples, and then we'll quickly talk about this partnership between my company and Favro that we put together, Favro Quick Start for game studios that are maybe struggling with the move to remote and they want that to be a better, more productive experience. And then we'll just open it up to Q&A. So let's get started. I'm going to hand it over to Patrick Palm, again, co-founder and CEO of Favro.
Thanks, John. This has been a fantastic summer, doing these webinars, and we're happy to notice that we're not only getting people joining and sometimes even asking questions. So remember that you can do that. There's a Q&A section here, so feel free to pop a question at any time and we answer it live or at the end. But also that there's been many we're starting to have a bit of a library now online with some absolutely amazing people that we have interviewed, and there's a lot of people checking that out. And I noticed that now with summer coming to a bit of an end here, that has also increased. John, what's also interesting is that I think the guests they've always been awesome, but our part, and especially this part when you go through some best practices with remote with the remote studio, that has definitely become almost better and better. So it's almost embarrassing to look at the first one, the third one, last week. It's it's a very clear progression. So we're getting better at this too. You have to for all of you now who's watching, you have to remember that neither John or I are Joe Rogan here. So we just get started with this thing. Carlos is a little bit more of a experienced person when it comes to doing good TV, and he might touch upon that, himself. But just to give you the short intro, how we got into this in the first place, how we started Favro and why we did it. My two fellow co-founders and I, we started and built another company before, which was a platform for agile software development, and it was an on-prem tool. And what we were seeing back then was that this agile way of working is crossing over to any kind of team, marketing, sales, operations, executive groups, basically everyone. So agile has definitely been going mainstream, which is not very strange because the world is changing faster. Adapting to ever-changing markets is the most important thing. So that's why business agility in general for the whole organization and not just for software development is so important. So we thought, okay, if we're going to create a tool that is designed for all of these teams, that allow each team to work in an autonomous way, the way that they want, but at the same time connects all the dots and help the whole organization with their alignment, and helps its leaders that would be an awesome tool. And we didn't think anyone had created that. So we had a chance to start with a blank sheet and do it. So that was the beginning. Then we had one more idea, and that was that we saw that most large organizations, they are organic by nature. And what we mean by that is that there's always an idea on how things are organized, but things move around all the time. You recruit new people, someone move on, there's new initiatives introduced. So everything changes all the time. It's just inherently how a big organization works. So we thought, if we need to design a tool that is designed for that particular organic nature of an organization, what would that look like? Instead of typical enterprise tools that are normally extremely process-centric, and the tool might actually be an impediment, rather than something that helps you. And then the third idea behind Favro was it's kind of boring. It's simply that the world has gone cloud, but people need to start to think more about security, data governance, especially in the light of GDPR, what's happening in California, what happened this summer with the court ruling in the European Union, et cetera, et cetera. So any company, and especially big companies, really need to think about these things. And we're one of the few, I think, startups who actually have not only the tool to support that, but also have a team that understands these kind of questions and can handle it. Some of our customers are more challenging than others in these areas. Some startups are maybe a little bit less. And then you have some other companies, like, for example, let's say Microsoft, that is extremely demanding on these kind of things, and not hard to please at all, for good reasons. So they really care about these things. So most startups are maybe not so good to serve that kind of client, but we were able to create something there. And speaking about our typical customers, most of our customers are quite on the innovative side, creative side. So it is typically companies, organizations who are doing something more innovative. And one of the fun thing with working with those kind of organizations is that we get to know the people. And what we do here in this series is that we invite people that we get to know from these great organizations, which basically leads us up to Carlos here. And super thanks for that you could join us today.
Oh, my pleasure.
And I think to kind of kick off the conversation with you a bit, anyone who looked at your LinkedIn or your background, it's pretty impressive. But how do you get started? How did you get into the game industry in the first place? And then what brought you to what you're doing today?
Yeah, I got in, I guess, at the time that I wanted to, right? So I spent 13 years, I think it was, roughly, like as a software engineer and program manager before I decided to go into games. And this was in Orlando, Florida, in the US. And the only real game development studio there is Tiburon, which is part of EA, and they make some of the biggest games on the planet, of course. And for me, it was back in 2010. It was just really the right time. I'm an avid gamer, always wanted to get in games. An opportunity came up to be part of like a new team on Madden NFL. Part of new leadership team there. So it was just a great opportunity, and so I decided to make the leap in there at that time. But then,
when is this? What time is this?
This was back in 2010, so 10 years ago.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, awesome.
Yeah, and it was great. Like, Madden was one of my favorite games. I mean, I bought that game every year for 15 straight years before I joined the team, so I was very familiar with it from a consumer standpoint. And just learning the ropes on how to drive production on a game team, especially one of that size with that complexity and that short of a development timeline, releasing every year. There were a lot of challenges in there that helped me both get up to speed quick, learn a lot, while at the same time bringing myself and my experiences to contribute, because a lot of it actually translated very well from outside of games. But yeah, then, from there, I spent, quite a few years with EA, working at VA Montreal on mobile titles. Then I went to EA LA to work on a new mobile IP. I went after some time at EA, then I went north to Seattle, where I joined Xbox for a bit, learning, how to work on console experiences, on console and off console. And then went back into AAA games, working at Bungie, where I was a project lead there, working on our game engine R&D, Destiny 2, all of like our live service infrastructure and stuff. So it was a great experience there, and then I just actually wrapped up my time at Turn 10 Studios, which I went to after Bungie, where I was the executive producer for Forza Horizon, and I moved back over into Xbox, joining Gaming for Everyone, driving product-led, product-impacting inclusivity across all of gaming at Xbox.
All right, awesome. And these times that happen now with COVID, remote work. Can you just share the whole kind of picture of how that happened with you? I mean, how prepared were you? How much did you change? I mean, what's the whole story from your point of view with this?
Yeah, so we had I think it was back in late February, early March, we thought that maybe we might end up having to work remote, and yeah, we were definitely not prepared. I mean, my team, the Forza Horizon team at Turn 10 Studios, we work with so many partners. I mean, our primary partner is Playground Games in the UK, who do a lot of the day-to-day development on Forza Horizon, but we work with other external partners as well who contribute to Forza Horizon, both the live program or new experiences that will are yet to be shipped, and for us, being a team that works with so many different studios like across the world, working remote for us would have been fine, but with our partners, we have to take that into consideration as well. But when we actually, happened to go remote, it was about mid-March. We actually were not prepared. We thought we were going to have an easy transition as a team, but we did not have an easy transition. You think you can be prepared, but you're not. I mean, for us, we all sat together, of course, like most teams. But that day-to-day constant interaction, face-to-face, being in meetings together, yeah, you lose that when you go remote, and then you have to figure out a different way to communicate. And yeah, virtual calls is one thing, but like you're just not used to going forth and having those ad hoc conversations that way. So we had to learn how to change the way we work, how to change the way our partners work, and as well, and to make sure that we were supporting our partners while also trying to figure out what we needed to do. So there was like a few things that that we ended up instituting, with varying success, of course, but we're always trying new things. I think as a company, we had a thing called the COVID clock, where we wanted to schedule meetings that ended earlier than they would typically end, to make sure that people had the time to like transition to another meeting, whether that was get up from their home desk and either go to the restroom or get a snack or whatever have you, but just have like a 5 to 10 minute break in between. So we had to be very cognizant of making sure we were ending our meetings early. And then the other thing too was we changed the way that we start our meetings. So usually, when you're in person and you kick off a meeting, it's just immediately right to business. Let's get to the agenda. What are the topics? What are we getting through? And the one thing that we ended up doing was starting a meeting by just having like a casual conversation. It didn't matter who was in the meeting or what it was supposed to be about, or how well you knew the person. We would just have a casual conversation, how's family life? How are the kids? How are you doing? All that kind of stuff. And just to kind of like break the ice and get people into, a good state before we actually got into our agendas. Which meant that we had to be really good about time management in our meetings, which is something that most companies, most people don't really do a good job of. And we had to get really good at that really fast. And then finally, like, you know, a lot of the rituals that we had in person before, like, you know, going out to lunch, and again, the hallway conversations, et cetera, we brought those in. It took a little bit of time, but we brought those in a virtual environment to make sure that we were still having those kinds of things, even though it was virtual. And even like the ad hoc conversations you would have, giving people the liberty to, you know, think it's okay to actually reach out and just have a general casual conversation with somebody like you would in front of the coffee machine or whatever. So, and then the final thing that we did as a team that was big for us was we also changed the way that we organized our work. For this, actually, we used Favro. And we were lucky to actually get Favro on site, like right when COVID was starting is when we actually started to use it in earnest. And it allowed us to not only organize much better as a team, to make sure that a lot of the stuff that we would talk about in person, how's this going, how's this progressing, it's just there now, and you don't have to waste time asking those conversations. But also for our partners, because you know, we have our development partners that we worked with, but then we also have tons of other partners within Turn 10 or within Xbox that we partner with, that you know, we have requirements for. Teams like licensing, partnerships, business management, franchise management, marketing, et cetera. And so, so we brought all of those teams along as well in our like Favro journey, if you will, so that, you know, they could also provide the levels of transparency we needed, and that, you know, all cross dependencies were very transparent to everyone, and we could track progress on those things.
It's very interesting, you know, this example, you know, you're giving, because one of the things we very often talk about ourselves that we are trying to design for is, you know, breaking silos in big organizations. And you know, what you're describing, you know, is exactly that. And obviously, you know, with COVID, you know, those things are even harder. But, you know, I have this thought I want to try with you. Sometimes you need like an inflection point, you know, something needs to happen, something bad needs to happen to shake up things, you know? Do you think that that this all, you know, was a bit of that kind of inflection point, that, you know, where, you know, now that kind of, you know, made you make some steps that, you know, including Favro, that you know, put you in a better place? So, you know, I'm a very optimistic person by nature, so I would like to think that there are positive things coming out of this crisis.
Yeah, I think, you know, for us, it was kind of an interesting journey, because like I said, we're a very, you know, close-knit team. We were used to working together, both in proximity and being very close as well from an individual standpoint. Most of the team had been together for a long time, almost since the beginning of Forza Horizon, like, well, you know, 8 to 10 years ago. And so when we first started to work remotely, everyone, almost on a daily basis, you could talk to anyone and they would be like, well, man, I can't wait to get back into the office. I miss seeing you guys. I miss, you know, the hallway conversations, you know, all that stuff. And they were not as productive as they could be. And as a result, they were also like working longer hours as well. And, you know, fast forward, after making a lot of changes, fast forward, you know, a few months later, and the tone changed a lot. Once we figured out how to work remote, and that, you know, as challenging as it is, of course, making AAA games is very difficult, but it is possible to do it remote and to do it successfully, despite the challenges. Yeah, the tone changed a lot. I think, you know, now several people that you know, I was talking to on a daily basis, they don't ever want to go back into an office, you know? And for us, we don't have to go back for quite some time. Still, we don't know when, but it's still seems way off. But even when the doors open back up, people are like, well, you know what, we can actually do this remotely. you know, what are we going to do about that? When it's time to go back in the office, can I stay working remote? I want to stay working remote. Is there going to be flexibility where I can work half the time remote, et cetera? So I think it's a big shift and an inflection point for not just obviously the games industry, but probably all industries. I know I have several friends of mine that work for companies like Twitter and Oracle. They're never going back. And as a result too, they're also moving from the expensive cities that they live in, you know, to more affordable cities.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, we ourselves are remote first, and we will still have offices, but they will serve as kind of hubs where, you know, we wanted to schedule kind of like a get together. You know, we do that and we meet up. And you know, there might be some people that prefer to, or it's more practical to work out of the office, but making let's say the norm remote, I think is a good thing, because then if that's your starting point and that's the norm, it makes everything easier, because then whoever is remote doesn't feel like it's a, you know, half you know, version of what you really wanted to do. You know, this is the real thing. And then when you decide you're going to get together, you will cherish it more because it might have a bigger social dimension, and you use that for those situations. It's interesting. Many of the things that you talked about now are touching upon company culture and you know, how to do that now remote and so forth. But when we talk about company culture, there's also other things going on in society. We had a very good webinar earlier this summer with Lina at Bonfire. We had a great talk about inclusion when it comes to diversity. And you're also talking, you know, doing a lot of work around inclusion. You know, maybe you can talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So, well, first, you know, back on July 1st, I became co-lead for Xbox Latinx, which is part of one of the Gaming for Everyone communities at Xbox. And then recently, as I mentioned earlier, I shifted away outside of game production, which I love game production, but shifted away from the studios to join the Gaming for Everyone team as a principal program manager for product-led inclusivity. So specifically product-led, because yeah, from a cultural standpoint, there's a lot of things various companies do. Microsoft and Xbox are no different to try to bring in a more diverse workforce, and then doing a lot of the work to make them feel included, right? To build that community within the company. And Microsoft does an amazing job of that. The one, I think, big gap that is in games, it's basically in any industry, but in games especially, you can see it, and it is talked about a lot, is inclusivity in your product, in the game itself. So that boils down to things like representation or accessibility, et cetera. And that's my job. So I came to this team to work with all the leaders inside of Xbox to, you know, help them with their inclusive growth strategies, and then also you know, work on my own project as well. Hopefully to, you know, redefine the game industry. Maybe we'll see if I get lucky to help drive inclusivity in the games. So yeah, that's in a nutshell the work that I've been doing more recently. And then there's a lot to come. A lot of it, of course, is Latinx focused, since again, I'm co-lead of that, but we have Hispanic Heritage Month coming from mid-September to mid-October. My team, my group is working very closely with several other groups external to Xbox to celebrate that month and bring awareness to it. But yeah, and then outside of that, you know, my journey over the years, especially as being you know, Hispanic male in games, especially in senior and leadership levels, I'm usually like the only one. And so I take that that platform, if you will, as an opportunity within, you know, the studios and companies that I work in, to help drive and promote more diversity and inclusivity, within those studios. Really, like at a leadership level, though, because most companies, they try to do a good job, and some of them do, of driving, inclusive diversity, at the new hire level, from like college students, that kind of thing. But not as good at the leadership levels. That's the area that I'm definitely most passionate about.
Awesome. And, to kind of go back to the conversation we had there in the previous webinar with Lina, we also talked about the fact that if you look at the demographics today of, who's playing our games, it's very, very diverse. And that should be reflected.
Definitely.
It's right for so many reasons. It's right for moral reasons. It's right for business reasons. It's just, right.
Yeah, a lot of the biggest game companies, of course, are very like US and Western Europe focused, right? And so we tend to make games that reflect our realities, the areas that we live in. And sometimes when we try to represent other regions of the world, we don't always do a very good job, and that's where the inclusivity part needs a lot of work. We don't always do a very good job, and there's lots of opportunity for us to continue to grow and get better in that area, because gaming is not like a, just Western Europe, US, Canada, and East Asia thing. It's a global thing. There's, over 2 billion gamers on the planet, and, we need to be able to reach all of them and make them all feel included.
Speaking about that, I have to ask you something. I read this report recently that today the game industry is bigger than the music and film industry combined. Did you expect that 10 years ago?
Oh, yeah.
Hmm?
I expected that even way before I got into games, back in the early 2000s. Just the trajectory, right? Like, I think it was, this was back in 97, I want to say, maybe it was 96, when Final Fantasy VII first came out on the PlayStation 1. Just, when you play through that game, and at the time, looking back, it obviously looks very dated, but at the time, it was just mind-blowing, just the cinematic quality of it, the storytelling, and yeah, when I saw that at that point in time, I was like, wow, at some point, this is going to be what most people do. They're not going to spend money going to a theater and watching a movie. They're going to want to play the movie. And yeah, we're definitely at that point,
I had this interesting thing the other week. I was just gonna eat something in front of the TV. I was just turning on my Apple TV, and I'm like, okay, gonna see something on Netflix. I was like, nah, I'm gonna see this whole launch event thing for the new Call of Duty game. Like, I would not have picked that some years ago. I was like, no, I'm actually more interested in that. So yeah, it really have changed, and it's really interesting when I speak with friends that are my age or older and are not entirely in with this, and they're like, not all of them are getting it. And then I speak with some of my friends are, let's say, a little bit younger than me, so it's still reasonably old, I would like to point out, but they're like, yeah, of course.
It's hard for me to watch a movie without playing a game at the same time on my phone.
Yeah.
Like, oh, this movie is so non-interactive.
It's awesome, and
yeah.
I think that there's a great documentary on Netflix. I think it's called Top Score.
Yep.
That I think does a really good job at kind of giving the whole background, how we got here. I think when you're in the industry, most of these documentaries feel a little bit too shallow, but I think that one was really good, actually.
That one was very well done. Yeah. And I'm with you too. I catch myself just finding more and more time spending consuming, video game streams, news, or just watching people stream things. Actually, even whether they're video games or not. Like, one of my favorite categories in Twitch is the just chatting category. And I like to just pop in there from time to time. almost every day now and just see what's up, what's on there, especially ones that are from other countries, other languages. I don't know what's going on, but everyone seems to be having a good time. And a lot of times they're also playing games. They're just not focused on showing the game on screen. And yeah, I feel, you know, I don't know, it's just more connected doing that than like, you know, just sitting down and watching a 2-hour movie, which I still do that a lot, but not as much anymore.
Awesome. And I have to take this opportunity to ask you, since, you know, we ourselves are in the tools part of the industry, and, you know, some that are watching might also be in that industry, or, you know, doing a start, which is in, you know, tools or middleware. Since, you know, your background is in production, I mean, obviously you have been someone who spent a lot of time, you know, looking at tools. What was your view on what makes a good, you know, tool vendor or middleware vendor, you know, for you know, for companies like us and others that are in that part of the industry? What do you think is important to be good?
Yeah. Well, first I'll say I'm going to answer it from a, you know, game production standpoint more than anything, because what I noticed when I got into games was the tools that I was used to using that I loved, they were not as applicable when I got into games. You know, they're basically a tool that's kind of like in a box, and that's it. You just use it, an agile tool, let's say, and it didn't really translate well into the complexity within game production, with all the disciplines and different pipelines and workflows that we end up using. And so, you know, for me, having a tool that is built from the ground up, understanding the realities behind game production is the most important thing, first and foremost for me. And there are very, very few companies that do this. And then from there, the next most important thing is being able to work with the tool vendor, tool developer, to continue to iterate on it and help them grow, in essence, providing features that you need, functionality that you need in order to be successful, that I'm sure other studios would also need as well. But being able to influence, in essence, what's on that backlog, what's on that roadmap, is definitely extremely important, I think, because, you know, the games industry is always evolving. How we do things is always evolving. And we need somebody to grow along with us at the pace that we grow.
Awesome, thanks. I think that's probably a good segue over to you, John. Getting a little bit into remote work best practices and a bit of Favro stuff, etc. Carlos, there's one question that is in the Q&A, which is a little bit off topic, but still very interesting. I was thinking that if you choose to, you can answer that in written form while we switch over to John, if that's an okay approach.
Yeah, sure, we'll do.
All right.
I'm taking a look at it.
Well,
Looking forward to answer to that too.
So super thanks, Carlos, for joining us. Absolutely great. And I will then hand over to your part of this then, John.
Great. Yeah. Thank you, Carlos. Great hearing from you. I particularly like the points you brought up about having meetings and opening up the meetings. This was a new one for me, opening up the meetings with a more casual conversation. I worked with remote teams and distributed teams as an agile coach even before the pandemic. And I often found it was very difficult for some remote team members, even at that time, to engage online, right? Over Zoom or whatever tool we were using at the time, right? Before Zoom took over the world. And they had a tendency to almost hide behind the camera. You know, they turned the camera off, number one. And they just weren't comfortable interacting, or they felt they didn't need to interact in the meeting. And to just break the ice, as you say, and just have that more casual conversation, I think is an excellent tip to make everybody feel more comfortable about having these online meetings in the first place. So thanks for that. So I'm going to share my screen. And we're going to take a look at some of the things that we've been talking about here in this interview with Carlos. more specifically. And again, I want to point out that we're using Favro to present during this webinar, right? So the tool is super flexible. Obviously, it's by game developers for game developers. The people who created Favro come from game development. Same with Handsoft prior to Favro. Favro is a much more flexible tool to the point you can use it for anything. I mean, you can use it to present out of as we are today. And I also want to call out that all of these cards are clickable. So for example, if I click on Carlos's card, you'll have his bio and a link here to his LinkedIn. And that's going to be true for any single one of these cards represented in this particular collection, as it's called in Favro, which is just a collection of boards and backlogs. So I'm going to make this, after the webinar, I'm going to make this particular collection public. And I'm going to share out a link to everybody who registered, everybody who attended, and it'll also be accessible to people who watch this recorded. Okay, so the remote game studio. And when the world kind of made this move to remote, was forced, as Patrick said, to make this move to remote, there were already organizations out there who worked in a remote first way. And one of those very inspirational to both Patrick and I, and one of the big reasons that inspired us to do this remote game studio webinar and this whole Agile Leadership webinar series was this right here. So Martin Miko, CEO, HackerOne, also a Favro investor. You know, he wrote this open letter to the world, really saying, essentially, we've been doing remote work from the beginning. They weren't 100% remote, but they were mostly remote. And he has this quote: "The Industrial Revolution brought us the idea that work is a place different from home and that work is done in physical proximity of many other people. It is the idea of the joint workplace that is the anomaly. Working from home is natural." And I 100% agree with this. I've worked remote myself for years now. And when I do some Agile coaching gigs where I've been forced to be in an office, it was the opposite for me. It felt so unnatural to be, you know, in that office environment. And that I think a lot of people just feel like, well, I'm in the office, so I'm working, even though maybe they're not really working at all. And there's a lot of problems with it too, especially in open workspaces, which so many offices are nowadays, right? This whole open plan workspace. And the next inspiration kind of quote comes from Jason Fried and David Hansen, who wrote the book Remote back in 2013. They're also the co-founders of 37 Signals, the guys who make Basecamp. Good tool, not as good as Favro, but that's besides the point. But anyway, excellent book on remote work. And again, they were ahead of the game working remotely, remote first company. And they say offices become interruption factories. The ability to be alone with your thoughts is in fact one of the key advantages of working remotely. Again, so true. When I was at Electronic Arts working in an open plan office, open plan studio, it was very difficult to get real work done because there are so many just ad hoc interruptions and being able to hear everybody else's conversation. And most people who did want to get real work done would put their headphones on and try to put the blinders on and focus, but it's very difficult, to the point where a lot of the real work back then, back when we were all in offices and studios, was happening after hours, or people would come in early to get the real work done, or they'd have to stay late to get the real work done, or they were doing it at home, which, you know, that's not the point. You're there to be productive. You're there to, of course, collaborate, be productive, innovate, get stuff done, build these great games. And it's very difficult to do in those quote unquote interruption factories. So some of the benefits of this move to remote, and these are benefits that some other game studios, right, that are actually Favro customers, like Unknown Worlds. In our next webinar, we're going to have the guy, Mike Threat, who heads up production for Unknown Worlds. They've been in remote and distributed globally since day one. And so they already realized these benefits ahead of time. But now, after the fact, this forced move to remote, people are realizing these same benefits. So the number one, right, is lower overhead. I mean, if you're running a small game studio or even a large game studio, just the fact that you may no longer need to have the overhead of physical space is huge. and all of the related costs that go with that, right? Utilities, the office furniture, maintenance, staff, security, everything that's involved in having a physical space, where maybe that physical space is a detriment to your actual productivity, that goes away. Also, the reduction in travel, right? So nobody's traveling now, and we can do stuff on Zoom. We can do stuff online tools like Favro and Slack. We're proving that maybe we don't have to travel as much, right? And we don't need to be co-located. Speaking of links here, I wrote this article for Favro, Run Your Entire Game Studio in a Single Tool. And this is a great example of how you can actually, Favro becomes the virtual studio. It's your virtual meeting place to get work done, to collaborate, to innovate, to create those fun experiences, right? And you can do it all in real time, just like you would in a Google Doc, but in a much more context-sensitive workflow type-based way, which we're going to see as we progress through this. This is key, I think, to Carlos and people who talk about diversity and talent. One of the huge benefits of this move to remote is the fact that there's no geographic restriction on finding the best talent. If you become a remote first studio, and Favro has been very remote minded for a long time, so they understand this, you can find the best talent wherever it happens to be in the world, whether it's in Kiev or in Vietnam or in Sweden or in Japan. You can work asynchronously. It's a little bit more difficult, but it's absolutely possible, especially with a tool like Favro, where you can have the conversation where the work happens. So this is just an example of how you can build tables, kind of recruitment lists directly on the cards. The cards are real-time collaborative. I have an example here in a second of an actual board in Favro, but that brings us to diversity, right? So another kind of side effect of the best talent and not being specific to geographic locations, or which typically happen to be very expensive locations, and maybe a lot of people won't want to move to an LA, or they don't want to move to a Seattle or a San Francisco, or these very expensive geographic locations where they're forced to move to do this work. They don't have to do that anymore. I myself, I live in Maine. I've lived in Maine for 3 years. It's not as cheap as people think it is, but it's certainly less expensive than San Francisco, where I moved from, right? So working remote has tons of benefits. And one of those is diversity as well. So this is something that I'm sure resonates with Carlos in his new role. You're able, because you're not restricted to those geographic locations. Diversity is a nice side effect of that. You can recruit from all over the world. And those are the people who you're playing your games, people from all over the world, of all sort of different cultural backgrounds, right? When I'm playing Clash Royale, which I play probably way too much, I'm constantly, playing with somebody from Japan or the Middle East or whatever the case may be. And so the entire world are playing these experiences now. So you need to, right, have people on your teams who can represent that diversity and bring that diversity into your products, into the games that you're actually creating. So just a kind of an example, and this is more to illustrate how Favro can be used for anything, to run, like I said, your entire game studio. This is an HR recruiting collection in Favro, and you can see this recruitment pipeline where somebody's moving from, you get their resume, to a screening call, to a team interview, reference check, eventually to, hopefully these are the guys that get hired. And this is just, again, to call out that when you have especially a remote organization, you need a tool that's flexible enough to not only run your production and run development, art asset creation, but also things like finance, HR, recruiting, licensing, whatever the case may be. And Favro has proven quite effective at that across the board. I mean, some studios, Favro companies have said that they've replaced upwards of 20 tools with one tool when they made the move to Favro. And I can see how that's absolutely possible. So another obvious benefit, and Carlos called this out, I think we become so conditioned, as it said in that first quote from Martin Mikos, we became so conditioned to thinking that we needed a physical workspace, co-located workspace, to get stuff done and to collaborate. It was very difficult for some people, especially the extroverts in your studio, to leave that behind and not have that daily interaction. But now, after they've been doing it for a while and they realize they can still have those interactions, although remotely, they can still collaborate, they can still be productive. They don't want to go back. I mean, polls are saying now it started out 50% didn't want to go back to an office or a studio, physical co-located studio. Now it's upwards of 80% of people polled don't want to go back to a physical office or studio, or they at least want to have the option, as Carlos called out, to be able to work remotely, say 50% of the time, or whatever the case may be. So that's solely because you now have, once you made that transition, as I did years ago, you realize it's a lot better way to work. It's more natural. It makes you happier. You have that work-life balance that everybody talks about. Finally, you're not spending tons of time commuting, especially in these expensive areas where you might have to live far away from the studio. You're not spending all that time on the road. An hour there, an hour back. Just you get all that time back. Not to mention you have focused work time now. Unless you have kids at home, but that's a whole other story. That's why I moved to a single office by myself, as you can see here in the background, to help with those interruptions. But anyway, happier people lead to happier teams, which has been proven to lead to increased productivity and creativity. Quick example in Favro, speaking of continuous improvement, happiness of the teams, this is just an example of how you can use this concept of Kaizen, change for the better, right? And make that a focus on your agile teams, your remote agile teams. Have your retrospectives here in the tool. Have those improvement items feeding a Kaizen backlog. Prioritize those improvement items, as you see here, the same way you would prioritize features and assets in the actual product you're creating. And you use a Kaizen board the same way you would use a sprint or a scrum board to make sure that those improvement items that you committed to in your retrospectives, those are actually getting done. A team that doesn't do retrospectives, doesn't think of this Kaizen continuous improvement way is pretty hubris in saying, we're so good, we don't need to improve. And no team is so good that they don't need to improve. You can always get better. You can always improve your environment. You can always improve the overall happiness of the team. And that's something that's very important to me as an agile coach. So back here to the remote game studio collection. Again, a big reason for the happier teams and happier people is no commuting. Average in the US at least is 300 to 400 hours per year people spend commuting in their cars, and you get all that time back to use however you want. Huge benefit right there. So the challenges, right? It's not all roses. There are definitely challenges. A lot of people are worried about studio culture. Are we going to lose our overall studio culture that makes us an actual entity? What makes Turn 10 great, for example, right? And they're afraid that that's going to get lost in this move to remote. And I think that's been proven not to be true, especially for the teams that had strong studio cultures to begin with. And by strong studio cultures, I mean, when you make the move to remote, any organization's strengths and weaknesses are going to be amplified. They're going to be amplified to the point where if you had a weak studio culture, you had a lot of command and control, a lot of, people wouldn't do anything unless they were told to do it, or that was at least the environment that was fostered. This move to remote is going to be very difficult. If you had a very agile mindset where the teams were self-managed, self-empowered, they were just given the goal for that 2 weeks, whatever it was, and they made it happen, then this move to remote was much easier because you were already in that trust and accountability mindset, right? And studios that didn't have that are finding it much more difficult to move to remote. To help with this, we have another link in here of this remote work playbook that Patrick and I wrote. Tips and tricks, best practices of a much better way to work remotely, hopefully. And it's proven that we've got a ton of traction on this, a lot of positive feedback, so we can tell that it's helped. So that link is in here in this particular card. Another example of maintaining the studio culture. This is something that Favro was doing when they made the move to 100% remote. They set up a Discord server separate from Slack, separate from Favro, to create an after-work gaming hub. And gaming is a great way to stay social together as a studio, maintain that social studio culture after hours, right? Instead of going to the bar, right, or instead of hanging out at restaurants, you can hang out online in your favorite games. And this is just an article we wrote on how Favro specifically set that up. Another big one I get all the time, and not just in games, but I get as an agile coach, you know, how are people working? I can't see them, so they must not be working, right? Especially in studios that didn't have that trust and accountability culture. And this was a problem. If that was a culture that existed, that was a problem you had way before this move to remote. And something we say in Agile all the time is, it's much better to keep your eyes on the baton rather than the runners, say in a relay race, because it's that baton getting around the track 4 times that actually wins the race. So don't worry so much about focusing on, are people busy? Are people working? Are people underutilized? Are people overutilized, right? If you focus on the flow of value, in this analogy, the baton, the rest will just come naturally. If the teams are focused on the flow of value, if the studio is focused on the flow of value, by value I mean features, assets, DLC, content drops, releases, if you're focused on that flow of value and not so focused on how many man hours do we have of this particular discipline and is this guy busy or not, then that's taken care of by itself, right? So track the flow of value. Don't track activity. Don't track, you know, tasks. Don't track how long, certainly how long somebody's actually online working over a VPN, so to say, which I've actually heard some people say they do. An example of tracking the flow of value I have here. So in Favro, there's all this built-in data collection going on, right? So not only can you visualize the work, which is huge. Like if you want to know how things are tracking towards completion, you can visualize the work on a Favro board, super easy, set up your flows, and you can see how things at the feature level or the asset level are tracking from start to finish. But also built into each and every one of these boards is the ability to view and turn on time on board and time in column. So these are the flow-based metrics built in directly into the tool. So if something has been stuck, say this producer review has been stuck in this particular column for 14 days, you're going to see that obviously a problem. If this particular feature has been on the board for 56 days, if you're working in a Kanban type way, that's obviously a problem too. So you're able to visualize that thing's stuck and where are things stuck just by turning on these 2 very simple flow-based metrics that are analogous to cycle time and lead time for those who are into Kanban. There's also charts, graphs built into the board. You know, you can get burn down charts, see how we're tracking towards completion with a velocity-based prediction into the future towards what we committed to in a sprint, in a release, so on and so forth. There's also other flow-based metrics built into the boards like cumulative flow charts and control charts for people who are more into the Kanban way of working. Another common one, too many meetings. And as somebody at Bonfire Studios, who I'm working with as an Agile coach, said, too many meetings aren't the real problem. They're a symptom of the real problem. And the real problem, it's 100% true, is if you're having too many meetings, it's because you can't visualize the work. You don't know what you're supposed to be doing. There's a lack of clear goals and direction. And you know that's partially culture. You know, you want to set up in your regular cadence. You want to make it very clear, this is what we're doing, and this is why we're doing it for this next 2 weeks, you know, for the larger studio for the next month or the next milestone, whatever the case may be. But you've got to set clear direction and clear goals. And you also have to be able to visualize the work in progress. So people don't have to ask, what am I supposed to be doing? They can just see it themselves. They can be more self-managed. And you need to have a tool like Favro in order to be able to do that. And that's going to drastically reduce the number of meetings that you have, these ad hoc meetings that you feel you need to have. So the question comes up too all the time, how do you collaborate and continue to innovate and maintain that creativity when you make this move to remote? And on the creativity innovation standpoint, I wrote this article about creating an innovation or creativity process pipeline in Favro. So take that idea generation, that creative innovation, generating those new ideas as seriously as you take actually getting the work done, actually getting that current development done. And there's this whole idea of an innovation process pipeline and how to implement that in Favro. As far as collaboration goes, especially cross-team even collaboration, this is how it's handled in Favro. So if you have a team that is working as a team in this particular collection, you have the ability in Favro to bring in boards and backlogs from other teams. So maybe you have to collaborate, this feature team has to collaborate with an art asset team to get done what they need to get done for each sprint, for each iteration, whatever the case may be. So for example, if you have embedded QA and they're testing this feature, take cover behind objects, this guy realizes I'm blocked. I don't have the art asset block model that I need to be able to test this. He can signal that this is blocked by moving it to a block column or tagging it as blocked. He can call it out here, what is actually blocked by, and have that conversation. There's things like auto tagging and auto assignment built into the tool. So when I move to a block column, it can automatically tag it as blocked, automatically assign it to the team lead or the scrum master if you work using Scrum, the person responsible for removing that impediment, that person needs that particular block model. They could bring in the internal art asset team's board into the same single screen collection. Favro is the only tool that can do this, and say, okay, well, let's drag and drop the same card. So now it exists in both places as well as in the team's product backlog, right? And say, to this team, inherently, just by putting the same card on their board, you've caused that there's a feature block, and you guys are now an impediment. So we just need this block model, and maybe they can swarm that and move that quickly through the art asset pipeline as far as they need to get it to that level of detail, just the block model. And that would remove the impediment here for the person who is testing, and they can continue on with what they're doing. So just the ability to have those multiple team boards in a single screen collection is so powerful to be able to handle things like cross-team dependencies, as well as the obvious having the cards, the Favro cards representing the work, the features, the assets in multiple places as well. All right, some of the solutions to these challenges. So for the remote culture, for the remote first, or the studio culture problem, right? So you've got to build in this whole very transparent, visible, trust and accountability type of mindset across the studio culture. These have to become not just your kind of written down values and principles, but you actually have to live these things. And you have to, as leaders in your organization, in your studio, you need to move to this servant leadership mindset, because the whole I'm a producer and I task out people on the team thing is just not going to work in the move to remote. Leaders within any studio, they should focus on the goals, giving clear direction on what those goals are, passing along the intent of what needs to be accomplished in X amount of time span, and then just get out of the way. And then they just act as impediment removers. They're the people there to help clear the flow, if you will, for getting those features done, to getting those assets done as quickly as possible at the team level, after they've passed along that intent. Now, for the individual contributors, you know, you're an artist, you're a software engineer, you're a gameplay mechanics guy, whatever the case may be. There's no studio to show up anymore. Showing up now means adding value. And you have to adopt less of an employee mindset and more of, you know, what I had when I moved from being an employee to somebody who runs their own company, that more entrepreneurial, you know, I am running my own business, and I need to constantly be adding value to that business. And that's how you show up as a remote employee, because there is no physical space to show up to. And of course, the transparency and visibility as to what's going on, not just at the team level, but at the entire studio level. And I have an example of that here in Favro, and this what would be called the studio dashboard. And depending on how transparent you want to be, you could open this up to the entire organization. These are our high-level studio initiatives. Break it down by development, new IP, technology, facilities. Maybe you don't need as big of a workspace anymore, so you try to find a smaller studio, equipment for remote team members. So the things that are driving the entire business of game development, the studio management side of things. You can have your entire studio roadmap here broken down into quarters or milestones. You can view that as a timeline like this, and maybe have this shared across the entire organization so everybody can see what's going on. You have that transparency, which leads to that trust and accountability, which is so necessary for this move to remote. You can bring other, for your games that are currently in development, you can bring in their entire feature backlogs. You can see that flow of those studio initiatives maybe flowing through what's called a studio portfolio Kanban. From start to finish. You can maybe even bring in the individual games, their release plans like this. See what's happening for each episode or each release. And again, view those on a timeline too if you choose. So this becomes kind of an information radiator to give that transparency to what's going on across the entire studio at a very high level. So you can really kind of break these solutions down into 3 high-level categories. It's the people, the process, and the tools. So people, that's the culture, the process. If you weren't agile or working in an agile mindset type of way before the move to remote, I think it's become even more essential now. Agile is all about adapting to change, and there's more change than ever now. So if you haven't made a kind of agility move, this move to what's called studio or business agility, now's the time to do it. And in all my time traveling around the world with Handsoft and Favro, specific to game studios, as well as other industries, but specific to game studios, agility never really made it past the team level, which has been my observation. Maybe to the teams of teams, but mostly agile teams. So teams were working in Scrum or Kanban, but it never really made it to what was the real goal of agile across the entire studio. So bringing in marketing, bringing in live ops. And these are all things that you can do, as you can see over here on this collection browser or collection panel. You can have live ops, you can have HR, you can have licensing, you can have external teams. The entire studio should be collaborating with each other, and the entire studio should be working in this agile way. Another important thing from a process perspective in making the move to remote is having a studio cadence. We're going to meet as a studio, an entire studio, every month, and we're going to pass along the major goals of the entire studio. The teams of teams are going to probably meet every 2 weeks to see what have we built, not just as a team, but a team of teams, especially if you're working on large AAA games. And then again, don't focus on how busy people are they underallocated, but rather just the entire studio flow of value, right? So from the high level down to the IPs and the individual games, down to the actual teams, you can track that flow at all levels, all the way up and all the way down in a tool like Favro. And of course, that's not going to happen unless, especially in remote, unless you make this move to self-managed teams, self-empowered teams. And then finally, tools, right? We're in Zoom today. Zoom's great for that synchronous meetings, so even those ad hoc meetings. It's great for webinars like we're doing right now. So I really truly think you can, the point being, I really truly think in your move to remote, you can ideally get away with just these 3 tools. Zoom for your synchronous meetings, Slack for your asynchronous general discussions, but don't try to run your entire game studio out of Slack, which I've actually seen some teams try to do. You need to have Favro, not just for the planning and collaboration and visualizing work in process, but you need it also, as you saw in that one example where the conversation related to that impediment was happening on the card itself, that feature card. You need to have that synchronous and even asynchronous contextual communications relative to where the work is happening. So Favro brings you the planning, the collaboration, the flow, but it also, and this is probably the most important thing in the move to remote, that contextual communication. The conversations, the decisions are happening where the work is happening. So if you were trying to find, how did we resolve this impediment of that particular feature, hide behind objects being blocked in Slack, it would be very difficult to ever find it again, to go back and say, okay, well, what happened there? Or I know that conversation was happening, it's not resolved yet. How do I get back to that in Slack? You're trying to search, I do this all the time. And it's super frustrating. But in Favro, all you have to do is open that feature card, and all the conversations related to getting that feature done are right there on the card itself. One more example in the tool. This is getting across even how easy it is to work with external teams and outsourced teams with Favro, and how you can track at multiple levels on a single screen collection. So here we've broken our art asset backlog down into internal assets and external assets. And we further chunked it into content traps. So these are all the characters that we're going to have in this particular release. These are all the weapons we're going to have in this release. Same thing for our external art asset development, environment props, and cars, whatever the case may be in this particular release. So because these are also cards up here in a Favro hierarchical backlog, you can take characters, for example, and say, let's track that up here. And you're tracking at a chunked up content drop level like this, or an epic level if you choose, on this board, whereas the individual art assets are getting done where at the team level boards. So you can say, okay, well, this particular character, Agent 11, is going to be worked on by this internal art asset team. And because we can have, this is great for an art lead or an art producer, art director, to be able to say, okay, but the external team, these external assets, I can just drag and drop and commit them to an external team. So this could be using Favro guest accounts. This could be using what's called external members. And it makes them seem like they're a part of your actual studio. And the same way it makes, now that everybody's working remote, your internal team feel like they're part of the actual studio. And you're all interacting in this single screen dashboard collection and driving that work from this single backlogs, so to say. Okay, so yeah, solutions, right? The people, the process, the tools. We've seen it work very successfully, especially using Favro and this whole incorporating more of an agile mindset, agile ways of working. It's proven to be very effective for teams making the move to remote. And we have some success stories here. Prior to the move to remote, we had teams, I went out and was interviewing game producers around the country, some of the best in the world, on how they work with their teams, how they work with externals, specifically using Favro, specifically using these agile ways of working. And you can see all these interviews, all these success stories here at this learn.favro.com/customer stories. Now, to help make the move to remote or help with your move to remote if it's proven to be a challenge and hasn't been that successful, Favro and my company, Broad Cove Insights, have put together this 3-day Favro Game Studio Quick Start, with the goal being you don't have to do it yourself, right? Go with a proven entity. We've done this multiple times. We've helped Riot, everything from Riot Games to Bonfire Studios with their move to remote. And it's just proven to be that much quicker. You can literally do it in an effective, productive way in 3 days. So first of all, included in this package, you get the 25% Favro annual discount. It's the only way you can get that. We're going to sit with you and figure out how is your studio organized and map that structure, map that organization, optimize it really in a Favro organization, creating those individual team level collections, the dashboard collections, even the studio level collections, and even down to the individual workflow levels, using workflow rules, restrictions, automations, setting this all up for you so you don't have to. We also help you with all the integrations. So Favro has pre-built integrations to the tools that you're probably already using: Slack, Jira, GitHub, G Suite, the list goes on. We'll set those integrations up for you at the collection level, even at the board and backlog level. It's possible to do it in the tool. And if you are using other tools, maybe you're even just using Excel spreadsheets, or you're using Asana, or whatever the case may be, we'll help make that transition easier by migrating from those existing tools to Favro. Included in this is the Favro Platform Master Training and Certification for up to 9 people in your studio. There's a whole list of what's included in that, but it basically makes sure you know how to administer in the tool, configure the tool, and all the capabilities of the tool, how to best use the tool to get the maximum benefit out of it. And there's online certification badges, digital badges that come along with that, again, for up to 9 people. Then there's a very short 1-hour end user training for the individual teams, the individual contributors, to help onboard them on the tool. It's very simple from their perspective, so it doesn't require a lot of time. There's a communications plan from start to finish to help make everyone aware of the transition to Favro and how that's progressing. And then once we flip the switch and people actually jump into the tool, built into Favro are success tracking and metrics, and will help you track, are people using the tool? Are people using the tool the way it was intended to be used? Here's the overall timeline of this 3-day quick start, and some more information on the integrations. Okay, that is it. Thank you, everybody, for joining today. And again, for those watching this recorded, any of the questions that have been asked during this, hopefully Carlos and Patrick have been answering them. Those will all be entered here on this QA board, the questions and the answers. So you'll be able to see all those when I share this collection out to everybody who registered for this particular studio webinar. And again, thank you, Carlos Sanchez, for joining us. It was a pleasure. Thank you, Patrick Palm, as usual, for joining us. And goodbye, everybody. And good luck with the move to remote, and hopefully your move to Favro. Cheers.